At the end of the Cold War, the number one threat to U.S. national security, the Soviet Union, collapsed. The U.S. was left as the world's only superpower. However, instead of retreating, the U.S. and its military maintained their international presence and engagement around the world. The U.S. has a total of 800 overseas military bases in 70 different countries. And yet, in almost all of these places, the U.S. is not fighting a war. What is the U.S. military doing, and why is it doing it? It's a $100 billion question. This is Snack Break. I'm Aroop Mukharji, and with me today is Reveron, a professor of national security affairs at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Derek, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Aroop, for having me.
So let's start with the big idea. You just released a book, a second edition, and it's called Exporting Security, International Engagement, Security Cooperation, and the Changing Face of the U.S. Military. All right, what does exporting security mean? I thought exports were only things like bananas, steel, and like barbecue.
Well, one of the big exports from the United States is, in fact, military hardware. And
like weapons and things.
Weapons,
yeah.
Helicopters, jets, tanks, and other equipment, communications gear, for example. And the basic idea behind the book was that during the Cold War, if you wanted to understand U.S. foreign policy, you would look at U.S.-Soviet interactions. Today, I argue, if you want to understand U.S. foreign policy, don't look at great power relations. What you need to do is look at countries that face security deficits.
Security deficits. They can't provide for themselves or something? Or?
Exactly. So it's when a country can't meet its national security obligations without external assistance. So in this case, it's the U.S.
That's the power that comes in to help out.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so in some cases, when you're dealing with a country such as Nigeria struggling against a group like Boko Haram, the U.S. can provide intelligence assistance, help professionalize their military, or it also works with developed countries. So for example, if France wants to do peacekeeping in Mali, France needs the United States to fly its troops to Mali. Or in the case today, very concerned about North Korea's ballistic missile program, the U.S. provides training and equipment to its allies, Japan and Korea.
So we're exporting our hardware, which we've been doing for a long time, but also we're exporting training and assistance.
Education.
How many countries are we doing this with?
It's almost every country.
In the world?
Almost every country in the world. I could probably count on about two hands of countries that we don't do some sort of security cooperation, which we think of as all U.S. military interactions with a foreign military.
So we are, wow. So it's like a place like North Korea. We're obviously not involved there, but
nothing with North Korea. But
we do with Russia.
We do with Russia.
We have joint military exercises with them, don't we?
We do it with China. China participates in the world's largest maritime exercise called Rim of the Pacific.
We participate with China?
We in fact invited China. So a year and a half ago was the first time. It's called RIMPAC, Rim of the Pacific. It's the world's largest naval exercise. China came about a year and a half ago, and they're invited to come again this coming summer in 2018.
You know, if we're involved with all these countries, what happens when those two countries disagree? So take, for instance, like Pakistan and India. We have this partnership with both of them, and it's kind of a strange situation because they don't like each other. Does that mean we get pulled into those disputes?
And that's one of the pitfalls. Because it's a non-exclusive relationship the United States has with almost every country in the world. Some relationships are more important than others. So Pakistan is in the top 5 of recipients of U.S. assistance. But as you know, the U.S. and India are developing a robust security relationship as well. The challenge for the U.S., I would say, both with Pakistan, with Georgia in the post-Soviet space, even in the Middle East, is not to get pulled into those conflicts.
Right, but there's a risk, right?
There's always a risk.
I mean, is it a good idea? How does it help the U.S.? Why should we be running around and helping Niger or Mali with their security deficits? How does that help the United States?
Yeah, well, there's I think several ideas underlie it. So I really enjoyed. I think Madeleine Albright, when she was Secretary of State, she was talking with the Chairman Colin Powell, and Secretary Albright said something to the point of, well, what's the point of having this great military that you're always talking about if you never use it? People inside the military get upset by that because they typically think the military is used to fight and win the nation's wars, and that's an important function, absolutely. But another important part of defense strategy is building global security. And what that means is training, equipping, and partnering with almost every military in the world.
Does that ensure that we have close enough relationships with those? If we have an intimate idea of the Chinese military or the Russian military, both it might prevent us from going to war because we are cooperating with them, but also maybe because we kind of know how they work and operate. Is that kind of the idea?
One of the big ideas under security cooperation is military diplomacy. And the idea is when the U.S. and the Chinese military interact, it's improving transparency, to your point. Yeah. So we understand each other, we understand each other's red lines, and in a way to reduce tension.
But with the smaller countries, it's probably less about that because we're not threatened by some of these smaller countries, right?
No, that's right. And so we aren't worried, for example, of let's take El Salvador in the hemisphere. We're not worried about El Salvador attacking the United States, but instead we're worried about the security deficit in El Salvador that's led to the rise of gangs which eclipse the size of local militaries. And so the U.S. works with the Salvadoran military in an attempt to provide national security for Salvadorians. So I would say there is an American political cultural side to this.
Are we trying to get goodwill? Is that the idea?
I think there's goodwill. It's also threats don't stay isolated anymore. Disease is probably a better example because disease knows no boundary. So 2 years ago, the U.S. Sent about 3,000 military to West Africa to engage, to build hospitals and to help against the Ebola crisis.
Does this stuff work, though? I mean, if we give $1.5 billion to Pakistan, they still got 99 problems in their backyard.
That's right.
How do we protect against? Is it naive to think that if we just give a little more assistance, we'll be able to solve their governing problems or any other, government's issues with corruption, et cetera?
Without a doubt. I mean, that is the big question. Does it work? And I guess I'll give the good answer sometimes. Okay. And the political answer would be they're also U.S. foreign policy programs. So even in the case of Pakistan, the U.S. does want to help the Pakistanis professionalize. They want to help the Pakistanis against its terrorist threat. But the U.S. also wants to ensure that the port of Karachi remains open for U.S. military equipment that flows through Pakistan to Afghanistan. So there is a quid pro quo side of this.
Do you think that sometimes with the Defense Department, and it's taking on kind of a cultural diplomacy, you said it's military diplomacy, do you think it's kind of overstepping its bounds as an institution, taking away some focus, say, from the State Department, which has traditionally been more involved with diplomatic efforts and cultural diplomacy? I mean, I think a big theme of your book is that, the military is taking on new roles.
That's right.
Building relationships. It's building wells. It's promoting reforms, agricultural reforms, and all these other sorts of things that were never part of the original mandate. Certainly not the Department of War as it originally existed.
No, and that's a fair point. There are 8 chapters in the book. I devote an entire chapter to objections of this. And there are objections in places that you would think, coming from the NGO community that says we can dig wells cheaper, better, and than the military. In the policy community, concerns that the military will eclipse the Department of State, and it is confusing, I think, for some partners of who is more important in the relationship. The senior military officer or the U.S. ambassador. And then finally, I think the third source of objections come from the military itself, that people join the military to fight and win the nation's wars. They don't join the military to teach Afghans marksmanship.
So then, but despite all these objections, it still might be worth it.
I think that's right. And so, since it is so non-exclusive that the U.S. is trying this all over the world in many different circumstances, there are some successes and there are some failures. And so successes that I like to highlight, because everyone forgets because they are so successful, is that over the last 20 years, the U.S. Brought 13 countries up to NATO standards. Because in '99, NATO was about 16 countries. Today, we're up to 29. That's a positive. Another positive in the Western Hemisphere is U.S. assistance to Colombia. That in 2000, you had the Colombian insurgent group FARC in the hills of the capital city. And it did look like the second oldest democracy in the Western Hemisphere was going to collapse. And so the U.S., with important essential oversight from Congress, provided the right type of assistance. Congress was very concerned that this would become another Vietnam. And so they imposed strict limits on, initially it was 400 uniformed people in Colombia at any one time. It moved up to 800.
This is Plan Colombia?
Plan Colombia.
Right.
Very focused effort, partnered with the Colombia, and then we can see today in 2017 the Colombians they're celebrating peace. FARC are legitimizing it as a political party, and Colombia is a very different country, and it could have been a lot worse. It could have looked like Somalia, which I would highlight. That would be on the failure end,
right.
because the U.S. has tried multiple times.
Well, it's also a hard place.
It's a hard place.
Now, is that related to this idea of democracy? Because I thought we've been exporting that a lot. I mean, because you can't really have one without the other, right? Or sorry, you can't have democracy without security, right?
I think so, and that's where the title "Exporting Security" is a bit play on sort of my own research agenda. Where when I went to graduate school in the '90s, it was about promoting democracy,
right?
And so I wrote my dissertation on U.S. efforts to promote democracy in Central and Eastern Europe. 9/11 happens, and we start to see what happens when there are security deficits, vacuums where the government can't control its territory, and the U.S. really started to prioritize more exporting security than democracy. And it took very much this security-first approach.
Well, all this talk about the military is getting me a little hungry.
I agree.
Could you agree?
It's time for a snack.
It is time for a snack, and I prepared a little snack for you. Terry, you think we could get the almonds? So right.
Oh, great.
So those are chocolate-covered almonds.
Okay.
Dark chocolate-covered almonds, and then I roasted and salted some almonds, and then I roasted and added some garam masala on some other ones.
Okay, so you roasted your own.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually not so bad. You know, Mark Bittman has this, how to cook everything. He's got a little section on how to roast almonds. And you just throw it in the oven for a little while and let it happen. So yeah, these, I'm going to take that long. And what's crazy about almonds, well, first off, I thought almonds were nuts. And it turns out they're what's called drupes. Have you heard of that? They're the same family as the peach family. But they come in these things, like fleshy fruit type things, and they're the pits, the seeds almost. So they're kind of the same as stone fruits is the idea.
I like your masala.
Oh, do you? Yeah. So garam masala is so my mom makes her own, garam masala, which is basically just pepper, green cardamom.
Cardamom, yep.
Cinnamon, and cloves mixed in there. And then, these guys over here are just the best that Whole Foods produces.
Right.
And
you can't go with
I trust them pretty well.
chocolate and almonds.
So these nuts, just very roughly, cost about $10. Okay. And if you add 40 to that, you get 50. And if you multiply that by 10 billion, you get 500 billion, which is also the amount of money that the Defense Department has in its annual budget.
Yeah, and it looks like next year it'll be about 700 billion. 700
billion
is what's hasn't been signed yet, but that looks like what's coming out of Congress.
That's so many almonds.
It's a lot of almonds.
Why does the Defense Department need so many almonds?
One, it's I'm going to reach back to I guess your interview with Joe Nye, where your setup really sort of described. You have international terrorism. You have the return of China and its expansive maritime claims. You have Russia invading its neighbors and annexing territory. So I guess I would say why 700 billion is part of that answer.
You think that we're dealing with new threats that require a lot more money now?
There's new threats. Some of it is also you have to recapitalize the force, which that the U.S. military has been at war since 2001. And full spectrum since 2001. I would add in the aviators really since 1991. So even though the Iraq War ended initially, Desert Storm in 91, that for the next 12 years, U.S. Navy and Air Force flew something like 225,000 missions enforcing the no-fly zones.
Wow.
And so you add on the no-fly zone enforcement, you add on the combat operations over the last 16 years, equipment gets old, it gets worn down. And so a number of bills are starting to come due. And I would add, because there was very little procurement during the 1990s, is sort of the other factor.
Is that because the Defense Department, the budget was, as a percentage of GDP, the budget was higher in the 50s and 60s,
right.
in the height of the Cold War. It was something like 9 or 10% of U.S. GDP. Right now, hovering around a couple Is that right?
Yeah, I think like 4-ish.
4. But it's still, still $700 billion. Feels like it feels like a lot of money.
It does, but with a $20 trillion economy,
right?
And if the federal budget is somewhere about $4.5 trillion, it's not quite. It's still a lot of money. Don't get me wrong. But I'll say the U.S. military is extremely busy.
Yeah.
And a huge role the U.S. military tries to do, and I would say with what I've been writing about with security cooperation, is conflict prevention. And so if you put on your old deterrence hat, and how you prevent conflict is to prevent other countries from doing what you don't want. And you do that by demonstrating force. You do that by increasing partnerships. And so it really is about conflict prevention.
And do you think that because of the changing role of the military over the last 20 years, that's affected some of these budgetary concerns? Because if we're trying to be friends with everybody in the world and we're cooperating more, that is going to also cost some money, or if we're selling more weapons and things like that. Is that a part of the story?
Well, it is, and I'd parse it a bit. So within the Defense Department budget, there is security cooperation programs. So the Afghan Security Force Fund, for example, is funded through the U.S. defense budget. The U.S. taxpayer pays the salaries for the Afghan military. The U.S. taxpayer buys helicopters for the Afghan Air Force. The U.S. taxpayer pays for Afghans to have armored vehicles. And that's in the Defense Department budget. What I call normal security assistance is actually in the Department of State budget. And so in the case of U.S. security assistance to Israel, that's funded through the Department of State budget.
The few billion that we send.
Yeah, it's about $3.25 billion.
So some of this is overlapping with the changing role of the military. Are they coordinating it with the State Department, or is there sometimes some tension between the two?
There can be tension, and that's what I would say one of the lessons too between first edition and second edition is because of the book. Is there has been a concerted effort to improve oversight of these activities. So for any U.S. military program to take place in a country outside a combat zone. Combat zones are different, but the U.S. ambassador must approve that program. The U.S. ambassador must sign off on any sale or gift of weapons, and so because this is a foreign policy program, Secretary Clinton and Secretary Gates enshrined it as sort of a dual key approach. That anytime there's a major arms sales, both Department of State and Defense have to agree.
Really?
And that's partly on the oversight is very important.
Well, Derek, thank you so much for joining today. The book is Exporting Security: International Engagement, Security Cooperation, and the Changing Face of the U.S. Military. It's the second edition. This is Snack Break. I'm Aroop Mukharji. Thank you so much for joining. To view more episodes, please visit our website at snackbreakshow.com.